Well, today we're in for a treat because this will be the first of two lectures on Jane Austen, the most beloved of all English novelists. Austen's dates, just so we have them in mind from the start, are 1775 to 1817. She's the author of 6 novels, including classics such as Sense and Sensibility, which appears in 1811, Pride and Prejudice in 1813, Emma in 1815, and Persuasion, a personal favorite of mine, from 1818. If you haven't read these books, you've probably seen or heard about the various movie versions. And here it's interesting to note that the Austen novels are not only adapted for the screen, but updated in different ways. Clueless, the terrific comedy of about 10 or 12 years ago, is a kind of update of Austen's Emma, and Bridget Jones's Diary is, of course, an update of Pride and Prejudice. Now, in this lecture, we're going to focus on the sociological dimensions of Austen's work, noting her responses to larger historical forces and concluding with some ideas about her use of comedic endings. In previous lectures, I've tried to stress the importance of the comedic ending to the tradition of the English novel, and talking about Austen will give us an opportunity to reinforce that point. In the next lecture, just glancing ahead for a moment, we'll turn our attention to the psychological dimensions of Austen's fiction, exploring her treatment of what later writers and critics would call the inner life. Let's start, though, with a brief review of her biography. Austen is born in Hampshire. She's a country girl, the daughter of a clergyman, and the 6th of 7 children. Her family seems to have been especially close, and she had really powerful and happy relationships with her sisters. Relationships among sisters, as many critics have noted, are often important to the Austen novels. She began her first serious writing projects when still in her 20s, producing early versions of what would later become Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Northanger Abbey. Unfortunately, these manuscripts don't survive. We don't really know exactly what they looked like. Now, interestingly enough, she stopped writing after her father retired and moved the family to Bath, and the family then moved around for quite a while after that. After the father's death, she and her mother returned to Hampshire, not to the place from which they'd originated, but to another place that reminded her very much of that original home. And the return seems to have freed up something in her. It seems to have inspired her in some way, because she returned to her writing when in her 30s and revised those original manuscripts, changing them completely in some cases, revised them for publication. Now, everyone always wants to know about Austen's love life because she's the creator of many of the greatest love stories in our tradition. So let me set you straight about that. We know of one fairly serious flirtation that she undertook with a young man, I believe when she was in her teens or her early 20s. And there is a family legend which suggests that the most pleasant conversation she had with this young man actually concerned Fielding's Tom Jones. I don't know if that's literally true or not, but it is one of those things that ought to be true if it's not. I'd like to think about Austen sort of joking around with a boyfriend about Fielding and about Tom Jones. She did receive one proposal of marriage from a much younger man, a wealthy man, and she accepted it, only to withdraw that acceptance the next morning. In the meantime, she spoke with her sister. She realized that she didn't really love this man, that she didn't want to leave her family, and so at the cost of some embarrassment, she drew her acceptance. She was 27 years old at the time. She never received another proposal. She died of Addison's disease at the relatively young age of 42. Now, in setting up this lecture, I may have surprised you by announcing that Austen was responding to historical forces. There is still a tendency to view Austen's fiction as timeless, to imagine that she and her characters are largely untouched by history. That description is not entirely inaccurate, since Austen seldom mentions major historical events or contemporary controversies. Famously, she never mentions the French Revolution or the Napoleonic Wars, at least directly. And this is perhaps a little unusual since her brothers served in the Navy, and when they returned home, they would discuss these matters with her. So it's not that she was ignorant. It's not that she didn't know what was going on in the wider world. It's that she chose not to speak of these things in her books. Compared with Sir Walter Scott, who lived and wrote at the same time, Austen's settings and situations may indeed seem trivial. Now, whenever I teach Austen, some of my students, especially the male students, wonder about this point. They wonder how the love affairs of more or less ordinary people can really be the basis of great literature. And here I have to come clean. I have to admit that when I first read Austen as a college sophomore, I had exactly the same reaction. I could not see what the fuss was about. And in fact, my teacher actually required us to read Emma. That's the first of the books I read. He required us to read Emma twice. And I have to report to you that on the first reading, I had this very common reaction. It seemed to me trivial. It seemed to me almost silly. But the second time I read it, it seemed like a marvel. You know, like how could a human being create a work of art so perfect? So Vern D. Bailey, my teacher back in Minnesota, he knew what he was doing. He understood that, you know, Austen, though immediately appealing to many people, is not everyone's cup of tea, at least not at first. Now, in dealing with skeptical students in my own teaching, I've often developed a couple of different ways of responding to their questions about her achievements. The first point I like to make is that Austen's love stories are among the greatest ever produced. There is a reason that they are so often made into movies. Austen takes from Shakespeare the image or idea of the bantering, bickering couple. And here you might think specifically of The Taming of the Shrew and Much Ado About Nothing. These are the plays in which we find these bantering, bickering couples in Shakespeare. And she works wonderful variations on that image. Her greatest love scenes involve teasing and humor, as if to suggest that the experience of love has to involve both the mind and the heart. Now, there's a side point I'd like to make here, and that is that the legacy of the bantering, bickering couple is actually taken up by Hollywood movies, Hollywood directors in the 1930s particularly. If you think about movies like His Girl Friday with Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell, it's the best. The Philadelphia Story, Grant Again, this time with Katharine Hepburn. Or the Palm Beach Story, a somewhat more obscure film. Preston Sturges is the director. Here we're dealing with Joel McCrea and Colette Colbert. You can see that these relationships are modeled on the relationships that we find in Austen's novels. These are sort of updated, modern versions, American versions of Austen's couples. So that's the first line of defense. If someone's skeptical about Jane Austen, you can always say, okay, they're love stories, but they're also great love stories. Now, the second response is to say that Austen only appears to ignore larger social issues. And this is the really important argument. As she works through her love stories, she actually confronts many of the most pressing issues and questions of her day. Now, to flesh out this argument, we'll turn our attention to Pride and Prejudice, a novel preoccupied with the phenomenon of social mobility. The heroine of Pride and Prejudice is Elizabeth or Lizzie Bennet. She's one of 5 sisters. Now, interestingly, Lizzie is not the prettiest or the nicest. That would be her older sister Jane, but she is an enormously attractive figure. She's smart, she's funny, she's spirited, and really, aside from some of the heroines in Shakespeare, I can't think of a kind of precedent for this kind of spirited female character in English literature. Lizzie's father is a gentleman. He's not an aristocrat, and that's an important distinction. He doesn't have a title, And his own position is somewhat insecure. I'll say more about that later. But he's a gentleman. He does not have to work for a living. He lives on the family estate, which provides him with an annual income of £2,000. Now, whenever you mention a figure like that, people want to know about conversion, right? What does this amount to in sort of contemporary money? And unfortunately, money doesn't work that way. You can't do a simple sort of multiplication problem and get a sort of reliable estimate of what his income would be in today's terms. Needless to say, it's enough to support him and his family, enough to make it possible that he live in retirement. He likes to spend most of his time reading. Lizzie's mother is from a slightly lower class, just slightly lower class. Her people are professionals and merchants, lawyers, businessmen. They're respectable and decent, and that's very, very important. There's a kind of prejudice through this period against people who are in trade. And you'll sometimes see that term pop up in these novels. Jane Austen does not share that prejudice. She doesn't think that people in trade are necessarily common or ill-mannered. Nevertheless, she does acknowledge that Mrs. Bennet's family members are not quite on Mr. Bennet's level socially. So when we look at Lizzie's parents, we can see subtle examples of social mobility. He has married down just a little. She has married up just a little. There is, of course, more to the story than that, for although Mr. Bennet is indeed a gentleman, as I mentioned before, his position is in no way secure. The family estate, which generates that income, can only be passed on to male heirs, of which the Bennets have none. Now here it's important to note that these arrangements were not specified by law. It would have been possible for the Bennet family to pass the estate on to female heirs. Just back in the day when they were setting up these arrangements, they chose not to. They chose to pass things down through the male line exclusively. That's another important consideration. That's another point of potential confusion. The business of the novel, in any case, as Mrs. Bennet realizes, is to get at least a few of those daughters married off to reasonably wealthy men. And so, although the novel presents us with some conspicuous examples of upward mobility, one local merchant has recently been knighted, for example, looming in the background is the awful possibility of downward mobility. Now granted, all of this business is not really sort of on the world historical level of the French Revolution or the Napoleonic Wars. But who's to say that it doesn't count as a pressing social issue, especially at a time, as we've noted, when the larger social issue order is in an unprecedented state of flux. Austen also responds to a number of other important developments. She seems to feel that the ruling and elite classes are in some danger of losing their authority, and that's a very important point. She seems to feel that the ruling class is in danger of losing its moral authority. Not necessarily in danger of losing its position of power, but in danger of losing legitimacy, what a political theorist might describe as legitimacy. In Pride and Prejudice, the major representative of the ruling class is Mr. Darcy, the novel's eventual hero. Darcy does not make a good first impression. He is fabulously rich, one of the wealthiest men in the country, as a matter of fact, but also cold and distant. In a famous early scene, Lizzie overhears Darcy and his friend Mr. Bingley talking at a country dance. Darcy's presence at this event is a little unusual. Back in the 80s, one critic likened it to seeing JFK Jr. at a local fish fry. What's he doing here? But it is rather easily explained, since Darcy's friend is thinking of settling, buying an estate in this area. Now, as we make our way through this wonderful passage, please note that there's a scarcity of men at the dance, and that's a real problem for any family with 5 daughters to marry. And note, too, that Lizzie is not dazzled by Darcy's wealth, social position, or good looks. Her ability to look past such things is part of what we like and admire about her. So here's the scene. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged by the scarcity of gentlemen to sit down for 2 dances, and during part of that time Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to overhear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who came from the dance for a few minutes to press his friend to join it. "Come, Darcy," said he, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. You had much better dance." "You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. And here I might just explain that Bingley has been dancing and becoming infatuated with Lizzie's elder sister, Jane. A couple of other things worth pointing out here. Bingley is not as wealthy as Darcy, but he's certainly rich enough, and unlike Darcy, he's friendly and amiable. In some ways, though, he's almost too nice. Getting his attention, winning his love, doesn't really seem like much of an achievement. Back to the scene. This is Bingley speaking. "Oh, she," Lizzie's sister, "is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld." See, now there he is, being nice. "But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you who is very pretty and, I dare say, very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." "Which do you mean?" And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Mr. Bingley followed his advice. Mr. Darcy walked off, and Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings towards him. This is the narrator taking over now. She told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, for she had a lively, playful disposition which delighted in anything ridiculous. Now, by any measure, Austen handles this scene brilliantly. She shows us that Lizzie is offended, as almost anybody would be, but also explains that Lizzie is able to turn the situation to her own advantage, using it to amuse her friends and delight herself. This is very, very important. We have to see Lizzie as an active character, a kind of resilient character, because she's going to be tested. She's going to be challenged over the course of the rest of the novel. And we have to know that she possesses the intelligence and the imagination and the wit she'll need to withstand those challenges. Now, in the middle of the book, the exact middle, as a matter of fact, in a scene that surprises many first-time readers, Darcy actually proposes to Lizzie. She's alone reading, I believe, and he shows up. He seems very nervous. She can't imagine what he wants, and it turns out that he wants to marry her. And she, is completely flabbergasted. Now, unfortunately, his proposal is not a flattering one. In the process of asking for her hand, he admits to thinking of her family and connections as inferior, and so she wastes no time in rejecting him. And here, skeptical male students might, take note of Darcy's mistake. This is not the kind of thing you want to do if you're asking a girl to marry you. You don't want to start by saying, "I don't really like your family. I don't really think they're as nice as my relatives." That's not, exactly getting off on a good foot. Now here again, we see and admire Lizzie's independent spirit. She is turning down the early 19th century equivalent of JFK Jr., and it is not hard to be impressed by a woman who can do something like that. As the novel proceeds, however, Lizzie learns more and more about Darcy, and almost all of it is good. And so she's forced to revise her opinion of him. At one point, while touring with her aunt and uncle, she pays a visit to Darcy's estate. He's supposed to be out of town at the time, and the house is open to visitors and tourists. You can go through it if you want to. And Lizzie, at this time, is stunned to learn that Darcy is actually a generous master and landlord. As usual in Austen, the scene plays out in a very interesting way. We'll start with a speech by one of the servants. This is the older woman who's giving them the tour of the house. Actually, no, we're going to start with a speech by Lizzie's uncle. If your master would marry, her uncle tells one of the servants, you might see more of him. Yes, sir, the servant replies, but I do not know when that will be. I do not know who is good enough for him. Now, what Lizzie alone knows is that having refused Darcy's proposal, she might be said to think herself too good for him. Back to the story. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner smiled, and these are Lizzie's relatives. Elizabeth could not help saying, it is very much to his credit, I am sure, that you should think so. Here's the servant. I say no more than the truth and what everybody will say that knows him. Elizabeth thought this was going pretty far, and she listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper added, I have never had a cross word from him in my life, and I have known him since he was 4 years old. This was praise, of all others most extraordinary, most opposite to Elizabeth's ideas. That he was not a good-tempered man had been her firmest opinion. Her keenest attention was awakened. She longed to hear more, and was grateful to her uncle for saying, there are very few people of whom so much can be said. You are lucky in having such a master. Yes, sir, I know that I am. If I was to go through the world, I could not meet with a better. But I have always observed that they who are good-natured when children are good-natured when they grow up, and he was always the sweetest-tempered, most generous-hearted boy in the world. Elizabeth almost stared at her. Can this be Mr. Darcy? Thought she. Now, as the group continues its tour of Darcy's home, Lizzie continues to think about the housekeeper's praise. Here's the narrator again. The commendation bestowed on him by Mrs. Reynolds was of no trifling nature. What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship, how much of pleasure or pain it was in his power to bestow, how much of good or evil must be done by him. Every idea that had been brought forward by the housekeeper was favorable to his character, and as she stood before the canvas on which he was represented and fixed his eyes upon herself, there looking at a portrait of Darcy himself, she thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before. She remembered its warmth and softened its impropriety of expression. Eventually, of course, Lizzie and Darcy do get together, as he sets aside his pride and she her prejudice. Now, it's more complicated than that, of course, but that'll do for a start. Yet even as we delight in their union, we must admit that Darcy's cold exterior is a serious problem, especially in a period when the authority of the ruling classes is being questioned. And so, in working out the relationship between Lizzie and Darcy, Austen is also shoring up the authority or the legitimacy of the ruling class. If England is to remain in the hands of people like Mr. Darcy, Austen seems to reason, then those people must not only accept their responsibilities to others, but be seen and known to accept them as well. What Austen wants in the end is a society that honors the traditional political values and mythologies of English history, that is, the mythology of connectedness, shared responsibility, and mutual respect. Through the union of Darcy and Lizzie, Austen creates an image of political and social regeneration, suggesting that the couple is destined to provide leadership for the rest of the community. In addition to personal fulfillment and happiness, Darcy gains from his marriage a sense of humility and perhaps also a sense of humor, valuable assets for a man in his position. We've seen this before, haven't we? We've seen it in Pamela. The same sort of thing happens. We've seen it in different ways in Tom Jones and in Evelina. It's a very conventional English ending. It's a very conservative ending as well. Now, none of these points really are lost on Darcy himself, who makes a very charming speech to Lizzie near the end of the novel, and I'd like to read that for you now. Here's what he says to her. I have been a selfish being all my life, in practice, though not in principle. As a child, I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Now, here we might notice that Darcy's account of his childhood is at odds with that of his housekeeper. You remember she said that she'd never heard a cross word from him? So either he's exaggerating his faults, or Austen is counting on us not to pick up on this little discrepancy. In any case, the really important thing about this speech is not the discrepancy, but Darcy's admission of his debt to Lizzie. Now listen to how he goes on. Unfortunately, an only son, for many years an only child, I was spoilt by my parents, who, though good themselves, my father particularly, all that was benevolent and amiable, allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, to think meanly of all the rest of the world, to wish at least to think meanly of their sense and worth compared with my own. Such I was, from 8 to 28, and such I might still have been but for you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. What do I not owe you? You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you I was properly humbled. So it's not just my imagination that this little scene and this larger drama has something to do with humility, the acceptance of modesty and a kind of obligation on the part of the ruling elites. Austen says so herself. She has Darcy say so himself. It's unmistakable that this is her aim. Now, because Austen's novels end in this way, as I've already tried to suggest, they may be the perfect embodiments of the English comedic tradition. Austen concludes by placing her most sympathetic characters into secure and satisfying positions, giving them what they want as well as what they need and deserve. And this is very, very important. She's upholding the notion of poetic justice. Lizzie gets to marry Mr. Darcy because she deserves Mr. Darcy. Darcy gets to marry Lizzie because he deserves her. These aren't just accidents. These are almost acts of providence. Things are working out as they're supposed to, as they should. And that sense of providential culmination or even consummation is a big part of what makes the conclusions of these novels so incredibly satisfying. But that's not all, because Austen is also creating powerful images of a society rescued from the twin threats of fragmentation and eternal collapse. Remember that early scene at the dance? We've got the rich men off on their own, refusing to mix with people who are only a notch or two beneath them on the social ladder. Society is threatening to come apart, in other words, and we need to imagine ways in which it can be reunified, brought back together. Now, earlier novelists, including Richardson, Fielding, and Burney, the folks that I've mentioned already, they had tried to do the same thing. But in my opinion, none of them had managed the task as elegantly or effectively as Jane Austen. And in the time we've got left, let me try to explain why I think that's so. Richardson finds it difficult to wrap up his stories. We've noted that tendency of his toward revision and sort of opening things out again. Fielding, for his part, relies on familiar plot devices, including the revelation of his hero's honorable birth. Austen, by contrast, concludes more naturally. Her heroes and heroines appear to work things out on their own and for themselves, overcoming obstacles, some external, the opposition of family members, for example, others internal, personal prejudice. I don't like you. I'm not sure that I want to get married to you. Through dialogue and eventually reaching a position of mutual understanding. So, in future lectures, when we talk about comedic endings and the role of marriage, we're going to want to keep Austen in mind. We're going to remember her in particular. In the next lecture, just looking ahead, we'll shift from Pride and Prejudice to Emma, and we'll shift from the sociological dimension of Austen's work to the psychological dimension.